I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a lot to cover. It's been a year and about 1 week. We're going to start with Will helping us break down the Biden dropping out of the Democratic nomination and Kamala being anointed his successor. Then Ben will take us through the Secret Service Director, Kim Cheadle, resigning from her position after getting grilled by Congress. And finally, Inez will take us through Trump's nomination speech at the conclusion of the Republican National Convention. A lot to get to, so we're going to get right into it with Will talking about Biden leaving the race.
Thanks, Amber. So obviously the big news of this weekend on Sunday evening, or Sunday afternoon rather, Joe Biden posted on X that he was dropping out of the presidential race. He was going to remain as president, but that he was not going to run or accept the nomination in 2024. Within 24 hours, the entire Democratic Party has consolidated behind Vice President Kamala Harris as the next presumptive nominee. It seems pretty clear that she's already lined up the delegates she will need to win at the convention, despite having not won a single primary ballot. So it seems very, very likely. I mean, there were a variety of people who endorsed. President Obama did not endorse, but I think my understanding of his view is that he's just doesn't get involved in anything intra-party squabbling at all. So he's just, the grand old man of the party. So he wouldn't do that publicly. It's the culmination of a very serious effort from the Democratic Party to push Joe Biden out, to get him to resign. I didn't think this effort would succeed. I think I'm on the record saying I thought Joe Biden would stick it out, that he didn't have a personal incentive to resign. So I wasn't predicting that he would. I am guessing that somehow, I think ultimately my guess is that this correlates a lot with something that happened in Las Vegas. He was scheduled to go on stage in an event. I think it was for the NAACP. And right before it, he canceled. They said he had COVID and he flew right back to Delaware. I'm seeing reporting that people actually thought there was a serious medical event. I remember reading somebody saying at the time they thought it might have been a seizure. Hard to know exactly what it was, but we haven't seen Joe Biden in public since that day. And it's been about a week now. And now Sunday, on Sunday, he announced, he didn't announce via video. He just publicly said he resigned. I guess I'm not huge. I mean, I'm surprised in the sense that I thought Joe Biden would stick it out. The Democrats are obviously giddy, and I think there's a lot of Democrats who think, the Republicans aren't going to know what to do with this. But really, I think the Democrat giddiness is understandable as there's suddenly variance in the presidential race again. I think it was pretty clear that Joe Biden was headed almost certainly to a crushing defeat. Whether Kamala Harris is going to succeed in the polls is unknown at this point. She's a brand new candidate. Who knows? It's possible she could perform better. So at least there's now some reason for there's a possibility of a good outcome for Democrats, and it's something they're excited about. But what polling I'm seeing suggests that Trump is beating Kamala pretty badly. I think that polling will continue. Kamala has historically been one of the most unlikable Democrats, and we can talk more about some of the horrible stuff she's done and the bad faith she has. But I don't see the American public, deciding that Kamala is the person they want to be their leader. I don't see independents in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, cozying up to somebody who was the most liberal senator in the Senate, a deep California liberal, and someone who's never really had to win a competitive election. Functioning in the California Democratic Party has always been one where you're selected, not elected, at least for the last 20 years or so, because that party is so dominant in the state. So I got to say, I think Trump's in good shape, but I'm curious what you guys all think about all this.
So my theory is that the Democrats know they're going to lose regardless. You can't win a presidential election in 100 days. I just don't think that's humanly possible. They're essentially starting from scratch. With Kamala, they at least get to keep the campaign money, right? And they can kind of kill two birds with one stone. They can throw her in, have her be the scapegoat when everything goes down in flames and they lose an election they were probably already going to lose. And now in 2028, they can say, we gave Kamala her shot. She had her chance and she blew it. So she's no longer at the top of our list anymore, and they can move on to potentially more desirable candidates. So I think this is really sort of a win-win for them to put in this this candidate that's really been sort of an ankle weight on their electoral chances for the past 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I agree that they can't win. I think a large part of this, and what's so clear, is that there's an apparatus both inside and outside of government. I think we all see that, right? Um that is going to work as a machine to try to get whatever Democratic nominee over the line. A lot of the talk about democracy is particularly, it's always a farce, but it's particularly farcical and clearly so now, with the way that this process is happening. I do think people have just simply forgotten how bad Kamala is. I had to cover the 2020 debates in 2019, and there's a reason that even then, when the DEI cards were worth a lot more than they are to the general public, DEI was more popular in 2019 and 2020 than it is in 2024. And that entire mentality of thinking, that checkbox mentality, that actually got Kamala a lot of great coverage when she jumped into the race. She was considered a top tier candidate, right? There was a lot of glowing coverage of her, and she has the resume, quote unquote, for it. But the second that voters heard her on the stage, her campaign started collapsing, and it didn't stop collapsing. She ended up, dropping out before Iowa, right? She was behind Pete Buttigieg. Okay. Like, she's not a good candidate. She's really dislikable. She's very stiff. She's unable to speak on the stump. I agree with what Will said, that in the sense that there's no coming back from late stage dementia. This introduces an element of variability that can only be an upside for Democrats, simply because there's just nowhere for Joe to go. But Kamala is not Joe in 2020. Like, as much as we don't like Joe Biden, and especially don't like the things his administration has done, and I've said repeatedly on here when he's done the State of the Unions, even in the last few years when he's clearly been in decline, he is one of the last Democrats who can do the labor Democrat shtick. He can lie about it effectively, and a lot of people in the country did think of him as old, normal labor Democrat Joe. And Kamala doesn't have that, and she doesn't even have the baseline of quote unquote charm that Joe Biden did in 2020. And
Right.
I just don't think she's a good candidate. I think we're all forgetting how bad she was when she was actually in the spotlight, to the point where Democratic voters who are primed to want a progressive leftist who checked all of their racial and sex boxes, even that cadre of voters completely rejected her.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly just jump in before you get bored, Ben, but I was just decided to pull up what was Joe Biden's approval rating back in 2020 when he was running, and when he had a plus 23 approval rating, 53 approved, 30 disapproved. That obviously went sideways. But right now, as we speak, Kamala Harris is well over 10 points underwater. She's got only like a 38% approval rating.
So this obviously would look like another data point to back Amber's theory, which is, I think, one of several plausible theories that Kamala is being put out there as a sacrificial lamb. Essentially, this year looked bad for Democrats. Whoever was going to be put up. This also explains not only why the party broadly coalesced, but why Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer and the others, Pritzker, all got behind her, which was they're happy to see her get killed in this race, and that opens up a lane for them in 2028. Another point that might substantiate this theory, and by the way, I think that you could put different weights on all the different theories. Let me just say, I still think this is going to be a hard-fought race till the very end. It's still going to come down to thousands of votes in several states, because the Democrats did win an election, prevailed in a basement campaign with a hermetically sealed candidate who, even if his favorability was better than Kamala Harris's, nevertheless, they showed essentially they can beat you anytime, anywhere, with whoever they want at the top of the ticket. And maybe we say that 2020 is kind of the exception to every single rule, but I don't think that we should at all take for granted that Democrats won't do everything possible and more to find a way to collect and count the most ballots in this race in the places where they need them.
I completely agree with what Ben is saying right now. By the way, that's
But
maybe
I would just add that if they thought Kamala was really strong, it's an interesting question. Why hasn't Joe Biden been pushed out under 25th Amendment or with the other leverage that was brought to bear on him to get him not to run? Now, maybe the working assumption, again, a plausible one, is he has so much pride. He never wanted to drop. And it was only when he was absolutely forced to, when it was more than just a drip, drip, drip of people saying he should drop out. And it was maybe more coercive. Maybe it was the threat of the 25th Amendment, as has been rumored. Maybe it was the cleansing of all the dirt that the intelligence apparatus has on the Bidens. There are any number of coercive measures that may have been taken to get him to stand down. But maybe the deal was, we'll let you finish out your term with some pride and on your own terms. But also, this keeps Kamala out of the spotlight of being the commander-in-chief and having the scrutiny that would go with that, which might torpedo her nomination. But another point that I would raise is, and we haven't even mentioned the name, I don't think yet, is Barack Obama himself did not come out and affirmatively support her, despite the fact the rest of the regime pretty much has. Now, is that because Barack Obama says, I want to create the appearance of this being a fair process where the whole party got behind her, and maybe there is some sort of faux competition during the convention, but Kamala clearly prevails. So it makes it seem as if there's a veneer of legitimacy of this effort, as opposed to just essentially like the Communist Party, but American style, swapping in one candidate for another and everyone coalescing behind. I think it's an interesting question of why Joe wasn't forced to resign. Obviously we can talk about it, whether he's fit or not at this point. And I think it's pretty clear he's not fit to be commander-in-chief. Why isn't Kamala now the president? Why aren't they giving her the test run of, you get X months in office? Is it because they want to keep her out of the spotlight because they're afraid that with the scrutiny of being a commander-in-chief, she declines?
I do think that the Obama question is a really interesting one. And I tend to subscribe to the theory that he is trying to give the illusion of choice, because the Democrats are going to have to face accusations that they have taken a choice away from the voters. Because if Biden is not so mentally unwell that he can't be president, then the Democrats are tacitly admitting that they're merely swapping out a candidate because they think that he's not polling great, which is hugely anti-democratic, right? The reality is that they have presided over an anti-democratic process the entire time. It was a sewn-up primary for Joe. They actively covered up his cognitive decline from voters. So this was a case where the voters did not have all of the information necessary to make an informed choice about who they were choosing as their primary candidate. And now fast forward, the information has come out. It has become clear to probably every American since the debate that Joe Biden is not up to the task, and the Democrats are now still handpicking his successor. So since the Democratic primary started to today, there has not been a legitimate choice within the Democratic Party voters, the base, to pick their primary nominee. And that's going to be a legitimate attack line against the Democrats, because it's true, for one. And I think Obama's maybe trying to get ahead of that a little bit with refusing to outright endorse Kamala. And then just on the polling really quickly, what I've seen so far is that Kamala performs worse against Trump than Biden does, even being as decrepit as he is. Kamala maybe makes the race a little bit closer in some of the Sun Belt states, but drops precipitously in the Rust Belt states, which they really need in order to win this election. So even though there is a potential upside for the Democrats, once she becomes a known candidate again, even being as veiled as she has been in the vice presidency, she still has mostly had a lower approval rating than Joe Biden throughout the past 3.5 years. Once she gets back on the campaign trail again and actually starts exposing herself more, I genuinely think things are only going to get worse.
Yeah, the reason that the Democratic Party is in this late stage scramble is because everyone understands how bad Kamala is, right, as a candidate. Otherwise, I think they would have coalesced much earlier if they would have done any number of things to force Joe out earlier. We haven't touched too much on whether or not he's just incapacitated right now. And I think Will is right that there are real questions about whether the president is completely incapacitated. It's hard to imagine that this kind of announcement, I can really only think of two reasons why this kind of announcement would not be accompanied by an address or at least a recorded video from the president or a press conference or something. One is that he's so not on board with this, that it's such a hostile takeover, whether that's somebody like Pelosi or Obama going to him and saying, here's a list of your cabinet officials. I have 50% plus one of them that will oust you in a 25th Amendment move forcibly. And that'll be really embarrassing for everyone. So just drop out and, keep the rest of your term. Or whether that's, what Ben has, I think, rightly been saying for months and months and months, which is that, look, this is a president who has an enormous amount of legal troubles hanging over him that are being cleaned up for him by the DOJ in a corrupt way. If that were to change, his entire position changes. And I think that was enormous leverage they have over him. So that's one set of possibilities where they forced him out and he just refuses to record this video or appear in public because he knows it causes trouble for the people who instigated essentially, a soft coup against him. The other set of possibilities, which seem increasingly likely, is that we knew he was not doing well physically. There are now multiple reports out of Las Vegas, mostly coming from law enforcement officials there, that there was some kind of emergency hold put on Las Vegas in terms of clearing the president out in Air Force One, right? So, I mean, it's not inconceivable that Joe Biden suffered some kind of really serious health crisis and that he's physically incapable of even recording the kind of 27 cut video that he has in the past. I'll just make one note about Kamala as the replacement and about the process that Amber was referring to and the anti-democratic nature of it. There is a very interesting comparison to be drawn between the two parties right now, which is the chaos in the Democratic Party is due to the fact that the elites, for some time, since the debate, basically, the elites in the Democratic Party disagreed with each other, right? There are clearly multiple visions of how to deal with this problem. And so when the elites in the party were at each other's throats, the party was in chaos. Now, I think increasingly what we're seeing is, with the exception of Obama, for whatever reason, I think Amber and Will both put forward good ones, for whatever reason, with the exception of Obama just being silent on it, the party elites are marching in the same direction and everything is falling in line. That doesn't happen in the Republican Party. For better or for worse, I think mostly for better. It doesn't happen in the Republican Party. The Republican elites were completely in lockstep against Trump, right, in 2015 and 2016. They continued to be mostly against Trump for the next, 4 years. And what's happened is the party elites have just lost power. But there is no ability now in the Republican Party, the smoke-filled back room, whatever. There just isn't that kind of top-down power. And the Democratic Party definitely has that, not only in its structure with the superdelegates, which is the way they forced out Bernie when it looked like he was going to win. But I don't know if anyone remembers also from the 2019 primaries, where Obama just very clearly went to a bunch of the candidates and said, time for you to drop out. That kind of coordination did not happen in 2015 in the Republican Party, right? Everyone stayed in and tried to become the alternative to Trump. So I do think it's an interesting thing to note about the two parties and the structure of the two parties and how they work. I think the Democratic Party will be in chaos when the elites are in chaos. The Republican Party will be in chaos if there were serious divisions within the base. And I think those divisions, especially after the assassination attempt, are very much healed, as much as the sort of chattering classes don't want them to be, and want to imagine that there's more of a support for sort of the anti-Trump wing of the party. But it's interesting to me what settles the chaos in the respective parties. And in the Republican Party, it's definitely the base. And in the Democratic Party, it's when the elites agree with each other. Correct.
Yeah, I think you're very much onto something there. I remember seeing all sorts of people talk about how, they're saving democracy now, or that the Republicans are opposed to it. It's like, we had democracy. We had a real primary. I worked for a different candidate. There were a lot of serious candidates, governors, senators, former, cabinet members, all of the former vice president, all of whom ran against Trump. They all lost. They didn't lose because they, lacked, they weren't credible candidates or because they were pushed out by, party grandees. They lost because they didn't have the votes. Trump had the votes. He won. Here, Biden didn't have a real primary. He barely campaigned. His opponents were Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips. That'll be a trivia question a long time from now, like who ran against Biden in 2024. The moment Biden was out of the race, it was like, bam, everybody lines up for a new candidate. Does that candidate have votes behind them? No, they've never won a primary ballot in their life. But they have the internal, I will say this about Kamala Harris. Her one talent is internal Democratic Party politics. Like not primary, not ballot winning, but just the internal machinations of how to get powerful people within the Democratic Party to support her and push her for various positions. It is actually quite remarkable that she became the vice president of the United States, given how poorly she performed in the Democratic primary. That's a testament to her understanding of how to work the internal machine of Democratic Party politics.
Well, and here's a question about that I've always wondered, and I'm not sure where I land on it ultimately, is when the party completely coalesced and really Obama et al. Forced everyone out and made Joe Biden the nominee in 2020, was Kamala Barack Obama's pick, or was it Joe Biden's pick as an insurance policy against him taken out? And was the idea that always that she would be next in line, or that she was ambitious and she would be subservient to what the party wanted, regardless of where she ultimately ended up? Not that you can get much higher than VP, and I think she didn't want to be a Supreme Court justice to the extent that was at one time rumored. Like, do we believe that she was actually viewed as next in line for the party and really Obama world? Or is she just a loyal soldier who's ambitious and will just try to get as high as she possibly can within the party? I don't know where I land on that ultimately, but I wonder what you guys think.
I think it's less Machiavellian and simpler than that. And Joe told us when he picked his VP, he said, "I want a Black woman." And that's a short list of people who had enough. That's where the friends but in high places sort of part comes in, right? But it's a relatively short list. He was picking, between her and Stacey Abrams and two other people, right? So I really do think that she is a DEI pick. She was primarily picked because of her race and sex. And the fact that she's a totally incompetent politician who couldn't get her campaign out of the gate, even with glowing coverage and just like huge fanfare from the media, the second she got in front of voters, she flopped. That was secondary to the race and sex characteristics, the checkbox characteristics that the Democratic Party in 2020, remember, 2020 is the height of all of this stuff, right? So I think it's simpler than that. I think she was picked for those reasons and pretty much those reasons alone, or at least she was on the short list for those reasons. And it is, I think I've said here before, I think it's kind of beautiful that the Democratic Party has screwed themselves so badly with this, because if they had carefully picked an heir under a president who was a presidential candidate in Joe, who's clearly old, like this was foreseeable. It was already happening in 2020, even from 2019 to 2020, he was clearly in decline, right? Very foreseeable. He said he was going to resign after one term when he was running. If anyone remembers that, right? That he was going to be a one-term president, a transitionary figure. So given all that, they had every reason in the world to pick an heir, like a serious heir, and they didn't. They did it based on checkbox DEI requirements, and now they're stuck with it.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're going to move on to the Secret Service director resigning from her post after perhaps the most colossal security failure to happen in modern American history, and after she got absolutely destroyed by Congress in a hearing earlier this week. I know Ben has been tracking that very closely, so he's going to kick us off.
So for better or worse, I had the misfortune of watching the entirety of Kim Cheadle's hearing before the House Oversight Committee, in which she pretty much refused, either could not or would not provide answers to some of the most basic questions regarding what transpired on July 13th, what transpired in the run-up to July 13th. How did this 20-year-old purported loner, purportedly with no assistance and little tactical training, end up outfoxing the entirety of the Secret Service and local law enforcement and the Homeland Security investigators that were on the ground, and be in a position, easy position, to assassinate a former president and a leader to reclaim that office in 2024? Why? How is it that that Crooks, the would-be assassin, had aerial surveillance himself, flew a drone over the site potentially multiple times, yet Secret Service allegedly did not have any aerial assets at the site? How was this building, how was the line of sight not obscured? How is it possible that there were agents, supposedly snipers, inside the building, but not covering the roof itself? And on, all the basic questions that we have. One, about the myriad failures, even just down to the basic timeline of when this person was identified as a threat versus a suspicious person, which was a sort of distinction that Kim Cheadle tried to draw out during her hearing. When was it communicated that this person was a potential threat? When did Secret Service act? Why did Donald Trump, why was he allowed onto the stage in the first place once there was this suspicious person? All these different questions. Was there a stand-down order given where counter snipers weren't able to fire until after shots were fired? Or was their sight obscured? And how did this happen? All of those basic questions, we got very little in the way of answers from Kim Cheadle. And despite the fact that she repeatedly went back to the canned answer of "I take full responsibility," et cetera, in reality, she didn't take responsibility. She didn't explain what the failures were, what Secret Service is doing to remedy them immediately. And essentially, she deferred to the FBI, which I think was the plan, which was, we are doing an internal investigation, but the FBI is really in charge of all of the salient details. And consequently, she got absolutely eviscerated, not only by the Republican members, but in some cases, frankly, with more pointed questions from the Democrat members, including Jamie Raskin, including AOC, including Congressman Muffume, and several others as well. So to me, I think Moskowitz and even Dan Goldman asked some legitimate questions. And you have to ask, why was that the case? One aspect, I think, just observing the demeanor of the minority members, is that they were frankly shocked at how poorly she performed, at how she obfuscated, at how she couldn't or wouldn't answer basic questions. They were also really pissed off, frankly, that she wouldn't take the bait on sort of the, well, this is all because Republicans are for guns and that's how this occurred line. She was very, very disciplined in not going down the anti-Second Amendment path. So I think that drew their ire as well. But ultimately, I think the conclusion that we have to come to is that Democrats were okay to offer. They viewed her as a scapegoat, a sacrificial lamb that was useful here. Maybe they felt that way on the merits, that she ought to be fired, that this was a catastrophic set of failures at the very, very best. And so that's why she had to be shunted aside. But I never take necessarily anything that the Democrats would do, and I don't think we should, from any politicians, at face value. And that raises another question of her resignation today. We're recording this on Tuesday. She resigned really hours before we're recording this podcast. To what extent is the resignation going to serve as part of the cover-up that I think we already see unfolding in terms of the chain, the links in the chain of failures, and then also, frankly, the real blackout on details about the assassin himself? Is this going to take critical information off the table, ultimately, with her out of the way? Is this something of a head fake where you're going to have another Kim Cheadle promoted up the ranks, and you're going to have the same failures in terms of personnel and practices? We still don't know what the cited failures internally are and what has been done to mitigate them going forward, except that the Secret Service has said, essentially, we've substantially beefed up our security measures and heightened our threat posture, essentially, going forward. Is this resignation essentially a Pyrrhic victory, or is this actually going to be the start of accountability? And are we ever going to get real responses to the questions that need answering from a security state that we've seen has been weaponized and hyper-politicized, can't investigate itself, and that has stonewalled congressional investigators repeatedly? So those aren't rhetorical questions. I open it up to the group. Your impressions of Kim Cheadle's resignation and the hearing, and then what comes next?
I'm actually kind of surprised that she resigned at this point because of how obstinate she was during that hearing and how many excuses she's come up with for her abject failure to protect the former president and the leading presidential candidate in this country. And I was heartened to see that there were a couple of Democrats actually who expressed their displeasure with her attempts to stonewall, including Ro Khanna and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of all people, talking about how ridiculous it was that she supposedly needed months to do an investigation, which included just something as simple as talking to Secret Service members who were on the ground that day. She said she wasn't able to have those conversations with them yet, much to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's dismay. She said to Ro Khanna that she believed that the Secret Service director who was in charge when Reagan was the victim of an attempted assassination had stayed in his post when he had actually resigned. It was honestly disturbing, pathetic, all of basically the negative adjectives you could use to describe a public official. And although it's great that she's resigning now, it just feels like too little too late.
Yeah, I really liked Ben tweeted a great thread, by the way, about his observations, and some of which he made here, but you can read that on Twitter as well, or X, I guess. But I guess Representative Cloud summed it up really well, I think, by saying, quote, layers of accountability turn into layers of plausible deniability. I think that has ramifications, obviously not just for the Secret Service. It's a large part of why nothing seems to work, not just inside of government, but outside of it, right? There is a real allergy in our like sort of governing culture now to direct lines of accountability, which is why, yes, I'm happy to see this resignation. This is, the Secret Service has one job, right? And it's to not allow what happened to Trump in Pennsylvania happen. And they failed at that job. They failed at multiple points. We're still trying to figure out, since she did stonewall in that hearing so much, gave very little information. We're still trying to figure out exactly where, but there's enough out there in the public sphere at this point to show massive screw ups on the part of the Secret Service. I'll add something, controversial, I guess, although I think it's very obviously true, that this kind of lack of accountability, the structural lack of a direct accountability and kind of plausible deniability, is both a feature of bureaucracies, and in particular of feminized bureaucracies. Heather McDonald had a great piece in City Journal a while back talking about universities and how universities have gotten feminized and how that has impacted the direct search for truth, right? To go out and seek the truth and to have a theory be absolutely false or be absolutely true. And look, this is not, I don't hate my own sex. I think there are things that are really important about the cooperative way that women work with each other and work in groups and seam together groups, but that's not a good fit in the Secret Service. Now, it's not that every single woman has that kind of sort of aversion to direct accountability. There are women who don't have that kind of cultural aversion or feminine aversion to it. But it does seem to be a tendency, once you have a female-dominated workplace, that the workplace culture goes more in that direction. And again, refer to Heather McDonald's article about universities, I think really laying this out very, very well. And that's a lot of what I saw in that hearing, that like absolute refusal to take responsibility. You are the head of the Secret Service. The Secret Service failed, right? And I'm glad she was forced out, but it's political expediency. And I second what Amber said. I was surprised to see actually some Democrats, I guess, when it comes to not getting shot, they're all on the same. They're all relatively on the same page. That might be the one thing that can unite Republicans and Democrats at this point, is not wanting to get shot.
I think that's a really interesting point about the feminization of bureaucracy, because it really becomes about social dynamics rather than outcomes and consequences, cause and effect. And if you're able to sort of talk your way through or put your boot on the neck of potential challengers, you become the leader. as opposed to in a less feminized bureaucracy, you would become the leader because you prove yourself through providing good outcomes, inspiring other people. And it seems like it was the case that Cheadle had basically socialized with the right people, meaning Jill Biden and her advisors, and that was how she ended up getting this job.
Yeah, I thought it was really entertaining when she kept saying, like, I'm taking accountability. It's like, wait, whoa. You mean you're taking...
If you say it, it's true.
Right, yeah. Like, and somebody asked her, how are you taking accountability? And she was like, I'm taking accountability. It's like, well, you have a 0-fail mission and you failed. There's one,
it's like therapy speak.
Right. I thought what was really interesting was there was a moment there where I'm like, you had a window into a parallel universe where you could actually see a serious country at work, where you had, I think it was 3 Democrats in a row who actually gave speeches I really liked to listen to, is Krishnamurthy, Ro Khanna, and then Mifune, the representative from Maryland. Both, Krishnamurthy is like, I don't get, how are you taking responsibility? You need to resign. Ro Khanna surprised her with the anecdote about the Reagan, the Reagan Secret Service head who resigned in the aftermath of the assassination. And Khanna made the point, it's like, you realize your job needs to have the confidence of both parties. Like, the Secret Service needs to be above politics. You're protecting our politicians. It really doesn't matter if you're at fault, you still need to resign. You get that, right? And then finally, Mifune just, he's this older Democratic rep who was like, I remember seeing John Kennedy assassinated and actually watching on live television when Lee Harvey Oswald got assassination. We can't have political assassinations in this country. What are you doing? And, it's just a parallel universe into a world where our politics actually was functional, because finally you have something where Republicans and Democrats are united. They don't want to be killed.
Let me just say one
Yeah,
last really quick point. Kim Cheadle is gone, but let's not forget that Alejandro Mayorkas remains, and he is her boss ultimately. And I think that gives you a window into the cover-up still in process.
Yeah, good point, Ben. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Trump's nomination speech at the end of the Republican National Convention. We're sort of going in reverse order here. But it is notable, of course, that he addressed the assassination attempt for the first time in this speech, at least in detail, shortly before the Secret Service director ultimately resigned. So, Inez, why don't you take us through a little bit of that speech?
Yeah, and I was pleased to see that most of the agents around Trump at the convention were over 6 feet tall, male, had the little bug in their ear, that was a comforting sight. But in any case, yeah, I mean, it's crazy that we've had so much happen since we last did this show, recorded this show last Tuesday, that this now seems in the rearview mirror, that Trump's speech coming out after the first time after he took a bullet to the ear for all the incompetence reasons that the Secret Service allowed that to happen that we just discussed in the last segment. But Trump came out at the end of a pretty energized and unified Republican convention, I would say. I'm not like a huge convention buff and, didn't watch every speech or anything like that, but it seemed overall that the energy was high and that, people were excited about JD Vance came out and gave the speech before Trump. I thought a very good speech, large part in the middle part there, taken directly from the speech he gave to NatCon, which is itself interesting. But Trump, obviously, the big draw there coming out. And the first 30 minutes of his speech, there was a lot of talk about the fact that he had thrown out his previous speech and that he was going to go for unity. I don't like the word unity, and I don't really know what that means. More often than not, that just means capitulation. But I thought instead of unity, what I would describe at least the first 30 to 40 minutes of this speech as a new sober tone to Trump, a new sort of appreciation, maybe because of this assassination attempt, for the importance of where he stands in American history, the importance of this election, the importance of his role in American history, maybe a little bit more weightiness of that. And you know what? If Trump becomes a statesman through this and keeps a lot of his strengths while also gaining a little bit of sobriety, not about his mean tweets or anything else, but about some of the decisions that he's going to have to make as we stand on the precipice, really, of a lot of incredibly destructive and dangerous trends in a post-constitutional, post-republic America. I think that'll be a really good thing for the country. And probably also good for Trump's election chances. And he seemed very cognizant of that, especially in the first part of the speech. People ripped the last part of the speech. He did go on, in my opinion, probably too long. It did get a little bit rambly, but the content of the rest of the speech, I don't know what you guys thought, I thought was all good content. I just thought, for the sake of time and place, maybe he could have save some of that for another rally. But all of the content was good. And he obviously was showing that this is when Biden was the candidate, that he can stand up there and talk for 2 hours right off the cuff. But I thought there was definitely like a new, and throughout the convention, every time the camera cut to Trump, like he seemed almost more, I mean, this sounds very silly to say as commentary, but like a little bit more sober, a little more serene, a little bit more contemplative. And that came through in the first part of his speech. And I think that would probably be a quality that would improve Trump as a president, as he looks at potentially winning a second term. I don't know what you guys thought about the convention, about Trump's speech, about any of this.
Yeah, so I was obviously there, as we talked about last week, when I was still in Milwaukee, and it is true that towards the end of the speech, we were all like, all right, can we go drink now? But I will say there was one moment towards the end where I thought, okay, he's actually just genuinely grateful to be here right now and is really enjoying this moment with the audience, which was when he was reading from the teleprompter, and then he actually, I think, realized he was getting towards the end, because it started getting into some of American history and how great of a country we are, and how he wants to continue that legacy. He stepped back and then went back up to the microphone and gave a shout out to Franklin Graham, and told a random story about how he used to go see Billy Graham with his father at Yankee Stadium when he was growing up. And it was just so sort of out of left field, and yet done intentionally with the way that he stepped back from the microphone and then told the story, that it seemed like, again, he realized he was getting close to the end of the speech and he didn't really want it to be over yet. So that kind of gave me a different perspective on how long that he went, especially since it was his first big public appearance since the assassination attempt. So I think people who are giving him such a hard time for going a little bit long in the speech maybe should reflect a little bit about the fact that he's probably just grateful to be alive, honestly.
Yeah, I had that exact same point. Just I'll let you go, Ben, but just like, I remember people complaining that he was rambling. I'm like, the guy just got shot, nearly died. Give him, he can ramble. Let the guy ramble.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I didn't mean to cut you off, Will. I thought there was a different aura about him throughout the entirety of the RNC. And interestingly, many people made the point that some of the speeches were about humanizing the man. And obviously, I think he showed a level of mortality and gratitude and humility in a way that we've never seen before, that was genuine, and I think resonated to the point where you had Democrats and people who hate his guts admitting that the first 20 minutes or so of the speech were mesmerizing. It was riveting, and a unique moment, I think, in American history. And what I would say is that the interesting thing is that in the purported efforts to humanize him and for him to kind of show his own mortality, he's actually become something of an immortal figure in our history. I mean, I go back to the image, the defiant image, fist in the air saying fight. That image is going to live on for generations. It can't be faked. You can't just make up that sort of level of courage. And the fact that the iconography came out the way that it did. So it's an interesting thing to watch him turn from, a hugely popular figure, beloved by tens of millions of Americans, into, frankly, a world historical figure. And ironic, because you don't get the sense that this was a person that his whole life had an ambition to be the president of the United States, even though people have been asking him about his interest in it going back to, I guess, the 80s or the early 90s, the famous Oprah clip, which I think might have even been showed part of it during the RNC. But it's a remarkable place to be in history, and that we got to witness. And I think the RNC captured it in a powerful way, and we'll see if it's a way that ultimately resonates with the American people.
Should I go further here on this, on the convention speech? I guess I should. I think, I mean, I thought the speech was fine. I thought the first part of the speech was really powerful. I thought when going, kissing Corey Comparator's helmet and going through the story of his, near-death experience, I thought it was really powerful. I thought it was super well done in terms of the visuals and the iconography. And I think I think it's sort of a resurrection of Trump. I think part of the reason you're seeing all these polls with him really massively popular, something's definitely changed in the culture. You see baseball players doing like the Trump, the fight and holding their ear and holding their, their thing. That's totally different. We would have never seen any major figures, popular figures, do something overtly pro-Trump, symbolically pro-Trump. But that's a totally new phenomenon, and I think it really bodes well for the campaign.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like something has broken. I think it has just become more after this assassination attempt, and then with this speech, it has become more acceptable in normie land to admit that you are supporting Trump. Not only we've seen, high profile rich guys come out like Elon Musk and pledge support and publicly endorse Trump, but I think on the more normie level, like I think we all realize how close we are to an alternate world where Trump doesn't turn his head, right? And he gets assassinated live on TV in front of millions of people and leaves the country in a really divided and potentially violent moment. And I don't know, I was touched to see the president come out after this and tell his story from his perspective of what happened up there. And again, like I said, when I was opening this topic, I think he did it with a kind of sobriety and seriousness that we're not, and gratitude that we're not really used to associating with Trump, right? He's brash, he's larger than life in that way. He's charming, but like of all the characteristics that I would think to list under the name Donald Trump, humility and sobriety, obviously not from drugs and alcohol. I hope I'm being clear here. He actually is sober. I think that doesn't even drink, but like that kind of like mental sobriety is not something I really associate with Donald Trump. He had it at that convention, especially for the first 30 minutes of his speech. But even before he went up to speak, I mean, just in every cut, you could see that his face, the kind of gratitude that he had to be there. I think the impressed upon him how important he is to the future of this country, and the trajectory that it'll go from here. And I think those are all good things for Trump to have acquired. Although, of course, I don't wish him the way he acquired them. But it could. I left that speech thinking this might have turned him into a statesman. And we talk about this in, every week. I feel like we talk about a new episode of crossing the Rubicon in this country. And one of the things that really depresses me or makes me pessimistic is looking around and just not seeing, a Washington, a Lincoln, right? Not seeing real American statesmen in the wings who seem to understand the moment and to meet it. And as much as I did like Donald Trump's first term, like I didn't feel that way about him either. And coming away from that, especially that first part of his speech in the convention and his changed tone, gave me some hope that actually maybe he will meet this if fully, not just because he needs to, or not just because things that he can do that other Republicans are unlikely to do, or because I agree with him on policy or find him funny or charming or whatever else, but like that maybe he can develop himself at this late stage into the kind of statesman that America can need. So that is was a very touching and like optimistic feeling for me. I don't know if you guys felt similarly, and I'm sure that events will rip that from me very quickly. That's how I felt listening to him come out.
Yeah, we're going to transition into final thoughts, and I will just use mine to wrap up a little bit on the speech, because one of the things that was really important in his retelling of the events that was even separate from tone was how little he actually made it about him. He talked about the Secret Service agents who jumped on top of him, risking their lives. He talked about the supporter, Corey Compatore, who lost his life being hit by a stray bullet while shielding his own family. Went over to his firefighter uniform and kissed the helmet. He talked about how proud he was of the crowd that day for not panicking and for not stampeding, which he believes saved a lot of lives. And it was very little about, well, they were there to get me because I'm winning, or they were trying to kill me because they know that I'm going to put a stop to their agenda. It was just mostly gratitude. So even the content of it was markedly different than from what a lot of people were expecting to hear from the former president. And then the convention as a whole, I would say, did a really great job of trying to humanize Trump. They had his granddaughter, Kai Trump, come out and talk about playing golf with her granddad and how he gives them candy and soda. They had people who have worked for the Trump organization for decades talking about what he's like as a boss. And that coupled with the testimony of the failures of the Biden administration and the successes of the first Trump administration, I thought overall made for a really compelling package.
So
Go ahead.
I was just, I'll be really brief. Just a thought that's occurred to me as we've been witnessing an insane news cycle in an insane year, and one that I imagine is only going to accelerate in the insanity, particularly if any and all of our enemies see the instability and sort of chaos here and volatility of our domestic situation as a green light to engage in all manner of evil acts against us or adversaries and partners. It just strikes me that we're being sort of desensitized to, and there's a normalization of what would have been perceived as totally abnormal, absurd, black swan events happening with such greater rapidity and in succession. And I wonder to some extent if the chaos is the point, or if this is just the natural sort of way in which a society is destabilized when you have a ruling regime that is clinging to power against tens of millions of people who really reject it. And I don't think it's healthy. I'm not sure where we go ultimately. I don't know how what was may in some way be restored or reformed. But, you know, it's striking. We had an assassination attempt. We still know very little of details about it, almost 2 weeks now onward. And that's not even the major story in the headlines. In some places, it's like a footnote, and it's barely even a saga to be followed when, you know, look, basically the message that's being delivered is that we can't, with the largest and most powerful and pervasive security state in the history of mankind, we can't protect the most high value potential targets, the protectees at the top of our political system. That's a massive issue. And that's just one story among a slew of stories in a crazy cycle. So the fact that 2 points that I'd make are, one, the normalization of the abnormal and the desensitization to it. And another is that there's zero trust in the institutions to investigate themselves, or for the putative adversarial institutions, namely the legislative branch, to get to the bottom of any and all of these massive scandals and failures. And as some noted in that Kim Cheadle hearing yesterday, it essentially creates a nation of conspiracy theorists because you can't trust anything that's presented to you by authorities. I don't know how we get out of that ultimately. Clearly, believing the institutions is unhealthy. The fact, though, that we, with legitimate reasons, totally distrust all those institutions makes it very hard to separate fact from fiction, what's truth and from what's false. And that puts us in a very difficult place in society. Maybe it's good that everyone is black-pilled now, or tens of millions are black-pilled, but it shouldn't have to be that way, I guess, is where I'd ultimately shake out. And it's not sure where we go from here, but I just put that up as a, sort of 30,000 foot view as we're deeply engaged in these hugely significant stories.
Yeah, there is this strange sort of LARPy feel to all of this, on top of it being very serious, that is really hard to shake. Part of it is, I think, just like watching the war between Russia and Ukraine, right, in live time, and watching war propaganda going from both directions in live time on the internet gives it a kind of video game feel, even though people are dying in horrible ways in that war. Um, there is that sense that's hard to separate from, like, that you're watching something happen. But I have a more, I guess, down to earth point for for the campaign. There's been some reporting that the campaign may use the tack that Tulsi used against Kamala in the Democratic primary, to talk about her law enforcement background, and to try to, like, come after her essentially from the side of criminal justice reform. I think that is, to put it bluntly, a really stupid idea. That attack worked because Kamala's unlikable and Tulsi is good on stage, and they were talking to a progressive primary audience for the Democratic Party. Actually, one of the strongest issues that Trump has for moderates, I think, is the restoration of law and order. Rising crime is something that worries a lot of moderates. It's what almost won a Republican the governorship of New York State. And the campaign would be really dumb, I think, to attack this one. Like, Kamala's a target-rich environment. There's lots of things to go after her for. I think this particular one would be just a disaster to try to maneuver around this aspect of her background, and in an environment that is, again, very different than 2019, where crime rates were relatively low in most cities. I mean, right now, that picture looks very different. And people are much more fed up with the regular crime and violence that's happening in American cities. I think this would be a huge mistake for the Trump campaign to attack in this direction. Not every shot is a good one against your opponent, and this is a bad one. So I hope they don't take that tack.
Yeah. I mean, they need to be a lot more specific. I think that a good shot for them, especially with their own base, but even with normal people. People need to remember a guy named David DeLayden did a whole expose of Planned Parenthood selling body parts, after post-abortion body parts. And instead of prosecuting Planned Parenthood, Kamala Harris decided that it was a good use of prosecutorial resources to prosecute DeLayden for having filmed that. That's a good example. I mean, she was abusive. But I think you're right. The theme should be not, Kamala Harris, strict prosecutor. That's terrible. We're the law and order party. People are tired of high crime. The real answer is, Kamala Harris, a weaponizer of the justice system. I mean, this is the longer term theme about what Democrats have been doing, which is we don't see the justice system as a tool to put bad people in jail, to put criminals away for their crimes, but rather we see it as a tool to wield against our political opponents.
Yeah,
And no
I think
better
that's
example
right.
of that than when she bailed out, she contributed to the bail funds for the 2020 rioters, right?
That's right. And I think Trump is probably listening to his advisors on this, who told him that running on criminal justice reform in 2020 was a bad idea, because in one of his first statements about Kamala, her ascension to the nomination, he referred to her as weak on crime. So I think that's a good sign. We're going to have to leave it there. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Will, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.